Thank you everyone for your passion and curiosity. We would like to invite everyone to please find a seat. We don't want the fire marshal to shut this crypto party down. History does not often repeat itself, but it often rhymes, at least according to Mark Twain. Please welcome Bill Tai for a historical perspective on waves of technology, community, and companies formed by the deconstruction and reconstruction of the flow of electrons, then bits, and what may lie ahead as blockchain automates societal behavior.
I could wait around for you.
Welcome, everybody. Kind of a big title. I was asked to do something that was a little lighthearted and a little expansive to get everybody up out of the weeds. So, title's kind of interesting. I think some of you that are developers or not know the initials IFTTT. I'm going to pause and get to that a little bit later. My name's Bill Tai. I started as a semiconductor chip designer in the 80s and then ended up somehow becoming a venture capitalist in 1991. I've been funding companies for 26 years, over 100 of them, and I'm affectionately known as the Kite VC for a bunch of reasons you'll see later. Why do I start this talk with a picture of Las Vegas? There's no city there. If you think about that photo, there was nothing but a bunch of sand in the middle of a desert. But somehow, that turned into this. How did that happen? If you think about what that environment was like there before, all you really had was sand. There was no population base. There was no kind of competitive advantage in natural resources. There was really nothing there. But something kind of magical happened. I don't know if any of you have read this book or know who Neil Stephenson is. Snow Crash, it's a pretty interesting, prescient book that came out in 1992. And it presaged a lot of the things that we see in the digital world today. In 1999, a good friend of mine named Philip Rosedale, who was then the CTO of Real Networks, approached me and said, I'm going to build my next company. And I said, well, what's that going to be? And he said, well, you know that book Snow Crash where you got that guy that drops in his computer screen and he goes into a virtual world and his like digital person, his avatar is so closely aligned with him that the two worlds merge. And when his character, and you'll notice the little sword on the back there, when his character gets killed by a sword, he dies in the real world. You know, virtual and real became one. So he did that, and he built what was today called Second Life. It's still around. He's moved on to a second one called High Fidelity. But there was literally a world with nothing there, a grid of a bunch of pieces of real estate and some bodies milling about. So what happened? Well, there was no structured environment, so you had all these bodies milling about in the virtual world. Clock forward a few years, people are milling about. Philip and I are sitting in front of a bar in San Francisco at 2 in the morning having a very ethereal conversation. And I said, you know, Philip, think about Las Vegas. What is Las Vegas? If you had a bunch of people sit in a circle and you put one poker chip into the system and you said, pass that chip to the right 1 million times a year, everybody would have $1 million a year of income. And if the velocity of money was high enough, you could basically peel little chunks off and build a casino and build a resort, build a hotel, build a city. So that happened. So he introduced something called the Linden Dollar. I became Alan Greenspan Gollum in Second Life. And that was actually my character name. That is not my avatar because I wasn't that good and I didn't have the time to do that. But I had the name Alan Greenspan Gollum. And sure enough, that poker chip moved. So by 2006, cover of Business Week, there were people making real money in the virtual world translatable into fiat currency. And all of the human behavior that we all have seen for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years was happening in this digital universe. And as Alan Greenspan Gollum, even though I didn't have an official role, I was always trying to figure out what's going to happen to this monetary system. And in 2009 and 10, I ran into Bitcoin. And on Thanksgiving weekend 7 years ago, I wrote Philip. I said, Philip, this could be part of the solution. You need to study Bitcoin. and away I went. So I started mining around that time, and eventually this the dining room of my house became full of equipment, and by there was a spike in my electricity, 2.5 million watts of electricity, law enforcement and power companies thinking I have a pot farm, and boom, that leads to this. So I ended up running into the guys that were mining and building what became Bitfury. Because of my silicon background, I ended up funding their 28 nanometer ASIC that they've moved on to 16 now, but this is an example of mining today. This is one building of 3 in Iceland. There are data centers in Canada, Iceland, there was one in Finland, Azerbaijan, Republic of Georgia, Canada. This particular one burns 8 million watts. Mine was 2.5 million watts. And Bitfury is kind of a monster. That scaling and replicability is what we're going to talk about. So IFTTT, it's like the if TTT. If this, then that. Basically conditional logic statements. Our life is basically a series of conditional statements, chained conditional logic statements. And if you can break down whatever flow, electrons, information, societal structure, into basic granular elements, you can then deconstruct first, then reconstruct in an orderly way, in a scalable, replicable way to make them very efficient and just massively scaling. So in my lifetime, I've seen 3 of these waves. The first was basically taking the logic flow of electrons. It makes up all the devices that use today that couldn't have existed without it, and basically breaking them down into little chunks that you could then reassemble with logic statements on silicon. That then translated into the same thing, reconstructing of the flow of information, first voice and data. And now we are basically reconstructing societal rule sets. So all of us in this room, it's a little bit like the Homebrew Computer Club. I moved out to the Valley in 1984, Sunnyvale. It was cherry orchards. The place, I lived in an apartment. The back fence was C.J. Olson cherry orchards. We used to climb it and get cherries. That whole thing has changed. We are in an environment now where the noise to signal ratio is very high, as it was then. There was so much going on and so many different eddies and ripples. People didn't really know what to do, how to make sense of it. And so the question is, how do you turn noise to signal into signal to noise? And there were a couple people that did that really well. In that era, the young people that would attend that sort of meetup, Bill Gates, Paul Allen, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, the guys that started Atari, the guys that started Sun Microsystems, the people that started Seagate, they were just like you. There's somebody in this room, probably several people in this room, that are going to emerge to do some similar things. So that was my introduction. I came out here to basically start reordering, doing that if this then that of electron flows. I joined a startup called LSI Logic. Most of you have never heard of it. It's been merged away. But it is one of the companies, so much time has passed, people forget, why is this place called Silicon Valley? And we're not in Silicon Valley itself, but the valley that used to be cherry orchards, it all sprang from this wave of reordering silicon or reordering electron flow, really from Fairchild Semiconductor. There were some very big companies that came out of that wave, Intel, National, Advanced Micro Devices, LSI Logic, where I came from, and then firms like Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield, and Byers. So the whole venture industry, the ecosystem that we knew, really formed around changing this. So what is this thing? This is basically a chunk of a computer that was on display at my college, University of Illinois. What you see there are vacuum tubes. Most of you, and there were vacuum tubes. You basically have electron flow steered with pieces of metal, and you'd suck the air out of the thing and seal it inside a glass jar, just like a light bulb, because if the electrons collided with oxygen atoms or molecules, it would get way too hot. So those kinds of things resulted in computers like this. The black and white thing is a computer from the 40s that was actually still in operation for 20 years after that. The thing in the color is a memory subsystem. And just to kind of put in the palm of your hand what this thought is, this is 12 bytes of memory. This, if any of you when you were a kid took a nail and wrapped some wire around it and put a battery on that and made an electromagnet, that was memory. If you had a coil, those are basically iron rings with wires around them to create an electron flow through a piece of iron, and you could tell whether it was a 1 or a 0 depending on which way it was flowing by sticking another wire in it and seeing if there was kind of impedance or resistance or not. So what does that mean? So 12 bytes, 5 megabytes. 5 megabytes in that era weighed 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds. The iPhone 8 is launching today, or this period of time, 64 gigs. That would be 28 million pounds of memory. But because we've been able to restructure all that stuff with great if this then that statements through transistor technology, everybody has that giant room and all that stuff in the palm of their hand. So there are going to be some very big companies evolving from this wave. A lot of people know me, so I always say I'd rather be lucky than smart. I ended up helping the government of Taiwan establish this thing at badge A001 at the formation of what today is called TSMC. Most of you don't know it because it's born in another country, but the thing's 213 billion a market cap. It's bigger than Oracle, Intel, a bunch of companies, 3 Fords, 2 Nikes. There are going to be companies like that come out of this room someday. Now this took 30 odd years, but it's going to happen. That led me to another wave, which was doing the same thing to data. So I had a company that was trying to send a semiconductor mask set, which is a description file for how you'd make a chip, in 1993. In that era, you had to take the data and put it on a magnetic tape that was the size of a movie. And you flew it across the ocean, got it through customs, and then drove it 2.5 hours down to this factory. You'd dump it off, and they'd read the data. And it just bothered me that I couldn't send that over a phone line. And that caused me to buy some routers, stick them in Taiwan, lease a half circuit, and I set up the first international ISP connection that was a privately owned thing to Taiwan. It became later 12 data centers across Asia, and Goldman, Morgan, and Solomon took that company public in 1999. But it was a great experience in learning what was to come. So we're now, the company's now broken up into pieces. It's parts of internet infrastructure and all kinds of companies, but it's become basically the part of the internet. How did that start? So all of you probably have earbuds. If you take those earbuds and you chop off the things that go in your ears and put another plug on them, you basically have a wire that can carry a signal. That is actually how conversations were carried over the phone network that originated in the United States and elsewhere. You would actually physically have to have a wire that connected, say, from Boston to New York to, Chicago with many hops and on to San Francisco to make a long-distance call. Super, super inefficient. Just like those vacuum tubes. Eventually, people figured out that it was much better to have many, many lines strung across in all kinds of directions, and you could basically take the voice patterns, chop them up into little ones and zeros, sprinkle them widely across the whole network, and have them reassemble on the other side. Super efficient. And then voice eventually just became a data packet along with everything else. And now the world is kind of covered with optical fibers sending little if this then that statements of all kinds of things that we know today as the internet. And thank you, AirSwap, for this graphic. So now we take the 2 waves that we have as a foundation, and we're now at the point where we're going to be able, as a community, to take human behavior, human-to-human agreements, law, finance, governance, and break those things down into granular elements and then build on top of them smart contracts that basically automate some of the things in a very efficient way. It's going to make a lot of things previously not scalable, super scalable going forward. So I think we're going to see a bunch of societal change. As I said, we have seen this before in the internet era. And, if you wanted to pick on one area, banks, and I'm not really picking on them because like telcos are still important today. Banks will still be important tomorrow. They'll just be different. If you think about the role of TCP/IP as a protocol inside the internet, allowing the digitization of those little packets and then the reassembly and then the building on top of it applications, that's quite a good proxy for, I think, what will happen to finance in general. If you think about what a bank is today, a bank is really, at its very core, a ledger of who owns what when. So the record, the institution, knows who owns what when and can tell you or tell another institution. Obviously, you guys are all here because you know the blockchain automates that, so everything knows who owns what when all the time, and you don't have to ask. So what happens when you take the very core value of a bank and make it automatic? It's kind of interesting. So that, the telcos weren't under that exact threat, but the packetization took away their revenue models on $3 a minute phone calls because they could be turned into data packets, faxes. They used to be very expensive to send a fax. Now it's just bits like everything else, can't tell what they are. They're little atomic elements, just like electrons in vacuum, that used to be in vacuum tubes, then silicon. They're flowing over the network and reassembling in all kinds of ways. All that work led me to 4 years ago, I was on Necker Island. I run a startup competition with Richard Branson. And I was with the guys at Bitfury because I'd funded them. And we just had this epiphany together, like, wow, you could basically swap out what is a Bitcoin running on this Bitcoin blockchain for other stuff. And not only is it good for, commercial purposes, there are all kinds of interesting things you can do around the theme of societal change. And so we created the Blockchain Summit on Necker Island for social good. We just finished our third one, and the talk at Ethereal Summit is to bring it to this point, a bunch of different things. We built that very first one around a gentleman named Hernando de Soto. And you've probably seen a lot of activity in a bunch of countries that are not as evolved as this one in the United States, where people don't have clear access to title. If you happen to, this presentation is going to come with a bunch of book recommendations, whether it's Snow Crash or Mystery of Capital. So Mystery of Capital is a fascinating one. Hernando defines the granular, foundational building block of capitalism as clear title to an asset. If you're a squatter, your tendency is to kind of take what you can from the land, run away when the authorities come. If you own that property, you want to make it better, and you have a title that you can take to a bank and get a loan, and then start to invest and build. 2 billion people of the 7 billion on this planet are not titled. So, we're at this point where the world growth rate is sort of just slowing and it's trying to get somewhere but can't. If there is a blockchaining of the identity management and asset identity ownership model for the other 5 billion people of the 7, wow. I mean, the world economy, I think, could go to a whole other level. So that was the first exercise, and we actually had a group of engineers put together an architecture that got put into Keiko Fujimori's election campaign in Peru. She lost the election, but the program's still kind of kicking around. At the very last Blockchain Summit just a few months ago, we got behind Power Ledger, and you guys may have seen it because it was the first ever ICO out of the country of Australia. Think about where we are today with power companies relative to phone companies. Looks kind of like what it did before deregulation in the United States. You have kind of monopolies, pseudo-monopolies over geographies, but if you could basically cut those little packets up, tokenize electricity, regulatory change is required. Think about the impact on a place like the Caribbean during the storm. A hurricane rolls through BVI, through Barbuda, through Puerto Rico. You have millions of people that do not have electricity for months and months because there was a central point of failure. If you could basically create a peer-to-peer architecture where there were hundreds of thousands of small solar roof generators throughout Puerto Rico, for example, trading in a marketplace where the energy was tokenized, you wouldn't have the problems that you have today. It would be a totally different ballgame, much better for society. and you could hold a token that's effectively a virtual battery. So there's actually a real value proposition in taking big chunks of things like electricity and turning them into little nuggets that can be freely traded on a marketplace. There's another one I'm working on that won a startup competition I threw in Oslo, Norway, that is dealing with carbon credits. So there is an organized system by the United Nations to have these carbon credits out there. If you're a company that needs to buy your slot to pollute, what this company is doing today is they're getting companies to, at Christmas, instead of giving everybody a bottle of wine, they write a big check, everybody gets a certificate that says you donated $20 million to own a piece of the carbon credit, and they basically buy in mass chunks of the carbon credit, throw them away, retire them. Makes it more expensive for people that want to pollute. Very noble. So, I'm helping them think through, wow, how do we turn this into a true tokenization, granularization of the carbon credit marketplace system, and can we get enough critical mass to really move a market, which I think is possible. I'm not, I don't want it to be a specifically anti-Trump statement, but, somebody's got to do something, and if the whole crowd can do it together, why not? Thank you. So, if we can get this going, I'd look for your support then. Other industries, music. So Imogen Heap and Zoe Keating came to the Blockchain Summit a couple years ago. Think about what's happening in music. Used to be big vinyl records, and then became CDs, and then became song by song on iTunes. And now you have DJs making a living off of remixes with like 4-second snippets of hundreds of songs. How do you track that? How do you put the power back in the artist's hands to earn income from their creativity, because they should be rewarded? And the systems today do not allow it. So Imogen, after coming to the Blockchain Summit, or actually Zoe came and told her about it, and then Imogen came to the Blockchain Summit. She started a program called Mycelia for Music. So it is sort of a music genealogy down to the very roots, where artists can register their music, and then the little bits can be identified and then billed for in a bigger fabric. So there's some really interesting things to come. There are some applications for conservation. We announced this July an effort to basically use the blockchain as a data repository for heterogeneous data types. I happen to work a little bit in Perth, Australia on some things, and I kiteboard there a lot. There are a bunch of universities that have been doing studies of the Abrolhos Islands. It's called the Galapagos of Australia. It's a place so far out of reach that it's still in pretty good shape, even though the Great Barrier Reef has died. And we have a team of developers out there basically working on a data fabric where data of different types from different times of different things can be connected to one fabric, and you can find patterns and relationships that weren't identifiable before because people did research and stuck it in a drawer. And so this is a very nascent effort. We have a prototype, but we're working with this organization, Mission Blue, that is, their mission is to create marine protected areas around the world, to prototype it on the Abrolhos, and then roll this data fabric out with all of the different hope spots as they try to cover part of the planet in a way that saves the ocean. Back to the signal to noise thing. It's always good to put things in historical context. Another book recommendation. So The Ascent of Money. Neil Ferguson, he's now at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He does a lot of, he's a monetary historian, and he's basically tracked the history of value exchange in civilized human groups since they started. And, whether it's like pebbles or feathers or shells or credit default swaps. And jokingly, as I've been helping him kind of get up to speed, he says, he won't actually do this, but he says he's going to do the age of the ascent of crypto. And he's got mixed feelings about it, so we'll see where it all goes. But it's very fun working with him, and I encourage you to read it to put some perspective on it. I cannot get through a presentation without putting a kiteboarding picture up. Thank you. So when you are starting to get on a wave, and that is me in the middle of a churn in front of a wave, it is one effing scary. And you cannot tell what's going on, and it's a little bit of instinct because there's data all around you, and it's conflicting because you see this moving, you see that moving, you hear pressure from wind behind you, and you don't really know what's happening. But it's, one, you just got to get on it, and you're all on it, and you have to try to just trust your instinct and use your time efficiently. So the worst thing you can do in a situation like this is chase noise, because you will splat, and you will watch somebody else right away. And this is a friend, Jesse Richmond. Some of the people in the audience, I see some other kiteboarders. This is another friend of ours that we kite with. And signal versus noise. So I wish you all a happy time finding that signal to ride, because you all deserve it, and thank you.